What a great guy, too.
Well, Bruce, thank you very much. How tall are you, Bruce?
6 feet.
My Lord. I've always had, one of the nicest things about being at the University of Chicago for all those years I was on the faculty there was I sometimes followed Milton Friedman to the podium. And I could actually raise the microphone. No, I still can from time to time if I debate Bob Reich. I can also raise the microphone. The difference between Milton Friedman and Bob Reich, however, is pretty clear. I looked up to Milton Friedman. We did have fun last night at dinner. Wasn't it fun? It was
Sure
great
was.
fun.
Yeah.
We saw this great big huge truck, 18-wheeler, crash into a lamp pole. That was a good start to the evening. And it got better as the time went on. And by the way, Dr. Fulton here, if he's not, it was great. I enjoyed it very much. I would have entitled your talk, "Without data, anything is possible." And by the way, that's true in my talk today, which I'm going to just talk to you about. I'm going to have a little fun with you, if that's okay. You don't? Is that all right?
Yeah.
I enjoy do that. 12 years ago, I moved from Rancho Santa Fe, California, to Nashville, Tennessee. Now, can any of you guess why I would do something silly like that?
Taxes.
Taxes, it was all taxes. I bought my house with my first year's tax savings in Belmead. And, after 3 years, the statute of limitations is over, the tax statute. So I can now go back and enjoy California from time to time without paying any of the taxes. So it's a win-win. Now, I do miss some of the things in California. I was on the Governor's Council of Economic Advisors, a part-time job with George Schultz and Milton Friedman and some of the others, Arnold Schwarzenegger. And I do miss, Arnold Schwarzenegger is a character beyond belief. And I do miss the character aspects. He wasn't a very good governor, but I do miss the character. One thing, I didn't know him really well at all for years. I'd met him a number of times, but just hello, how, that type of thing, no talk. And he invited me to come up to his house just before he was elected governor to have breakfast. And so I went up there, and I knew very well that this guy has a very sharp wit and is a very aggressive conversational style. So what I decided to do was I figured my best defense was an aggressive offense. So I did. So I go up there, and we go outside, and we're sitting on his patio in Bel Air. And I just said, Arnold, I'm just so delighted. Just so delighted you're going for governor. I think it's wonderful. And I was just over the moon happy when I found out your two best advisors were Wilson and Buffett. I was just amazed. I was so excited until I found out it wasn't Jimmy and Owen. When I found out it was Pete and Warren, he does one of his ha, and jiggles when he goes ha. And about 3 minutes later in the conversation, he says, "Awesome. Why is it all nuclear-seeking economists are so short?" How does that come from? And he says, no, it's Tom Milton Friedman can't be more than 4 feet 6 inches tall, little bitty tiny man. And you also, you remind me of Danny DeVito. I starred with him in Twins. So. But I do miss California. But let me, if I can, I want to touch on you with economics, and I want to get into economics and politics, because politics is where economics, the rubber hits the road. And so I want to sort of blend the two topics. And if you think about economics in just basic terms, economics is all about incentives. And why did I move from California to Nashville? You can say taxes, but the principle is that there are two locations, A and B. And they raise taxes in B, and they lower them in A. Producers and manufacturers are going to move from to, am I going way over your heads this morning? And I said that at Harvard, and I still don't get why you moved, Art. The Harvard professors, they all have round shoulders and flat foreheads. I don't know if you're aware of that. you ask them a question, they always go, you tell them the answer and they go. But economics is all about incentives, and it's really basic, it's really simple. All of you are as good as any professor of economics. I mean, seriously, if you tax people who work, and you pay people who don't work, do I need to say the next sentence to you?
What do you get?
Don't be surprised if you find a lot of people not working. You know, if you tax rich people, and you give the money to poor people, you're going to get lots and lots of poor people and no rich people. People respond to incentives. I mean, and that's what, you know, an economy cannot tax itself into prosperity. It just doesn't work that way. As Jack Kemp always said to me, you can't love jobs and hate job creators. And this is all Econ 1 stuff, but it's the stuff you forget by the time you get your PhD, and I mean that. I mean, a poor person, have you ever heard of a poor person spending himself into wealth? No. I mean, it's crazy, it's just silly. Yet the theories of economics is that the way the government creates prosperity is by government spending. Let me, if I can, just go through some of the stuff with you on public policy. And then, by the way, I wanted to say that I'm a huge fan of yours. In fact, when I lived in California, I had 17 acres in Rancho Santa Fe, and I had probably the best private tree collection in the country, private. But I had all of my watering system was PVC, just so you know. I had the big ones and the little ones, all the little connectors. I personally didn't do it. I had a guy who did it. But, you know, so I consider it my problem. But it was really great. We had that. I told him last night that every 100 yards, I would take the little drip things that would go into there. Every 100 yards, I'd have a little bowl there instead of a tree. Because if you don't do that, the coyotes, when they come by, they nibble off the drippers so they can get a drink of water. So you keep a little bowl there so they go by and drink. I mean, just fun stuff, and I love the product. Let me, if I can, I finished the book a little bit ago. It's called An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of, and I put the last word states. As you know, this is just a copy of Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. But if you look at the U.S., I mean, one of the coolest things about the U.S., and I think probably Canada too, I don't know if the provinces have wildly different policies, but the U.S., we have 50 states in this wonderful country of ours. In each state, we have probably 80 counties, something like that. And in each county, we may have 3 or so municipalities. These governments have been operating in serious form well over 100 years in the post-World War II period, 1948, so they've been operating for 70 years. In the U.S., we have repositories of data. I mean, it is incredible the amount of information we have on these states. And yet, if you go to a state legislature or to a governor or to anyone else in that, they have not a clue about what's going on in the world. I mean, if you ask legislators what's going on in their state, they probably know some of the major bills over the last 4 or 5 years, and of course, this week's, you know, legislative agenda they know pretty well. But they have no sort of background knowledge or information, and you ask them about anything outside their state, and they really almost know nothing. I mean, they may remember something like Prop 13 in California. Wasn't that a property tax initiative back in the 70s, late? You know, they have some of that. But let me just say, with 50 states, and with 70 plus years worth, if anything can happen, believe me, it has happened. It may have happened in Idaho in 1969 or Maine in 1984, but we have a huge repository of information in the U.S. on how the world works. So what I decided to do in this book was sort of try to collect all those data, and it's a fairly big, thick book, collect all those data sort of to put an overview, a 30,000-foot view of the U.S. There. And let me, if I can, take you, one of the chapters I have is California versus Texas. Really a detailed of how the 2 states run, what the differences are, all of that stuff. I mean, it's an amazing thing there and differences. And I had another chapter which is sort of fun. We have 9 zero-income tax rate states in the U.S., and there are 9 with the highest income tax rates. And I looked at those 9 states with no income tax compared to the 9 states with those with the highest tax rates. Looked at all the, I mean, the 9 states with 0 income taxes beat the living bejeebers out of the highest income tax rate states and everything. And you know, you go through all this, but the one I want to go through with you is the first chapter, which I call The Fall from Grace. If you look at the US, there are 11 states that have introduced an income tax since 1960. 11 states. They're normal states, you know, they're sort of, the first one was West Virginia, introduced its income tax in 1961. The most recent one was Connecticut under Lowell Weicker. It introduced its income tax in 1991. All the sort of states in the middle there are the other 9 ones. One was Rhode Island, introduced its tax. Maine was a zero income tax state. It introduced a tax as well. You go down south, down the coast a little bit, and you get to New Jersey. New Jersey introduced income tax. I mean, if you want to get this fun thing on New Jersey, I mean, I'm going to come back to New Jersey for you for a second. In 1965, New Jersey had neither an income tax nor a sales tax. Okay? I mean, it's amazing some of the. Then you start coming west. Pennsylvania had no income tax. They put in an income tax. Ohio did the same thing. Indiana did the same thing. Michigan put in an income tax. Illinois put in an income tax. Nebraska put in an income tax. There are 11 states. As you can see, it's pretty broad-based which states put it in. So what I did, and just, you know, without data, everything is possible, or anything is possible. What I did very simply was I looked at each of those 11 states. I looked at the year they put in the income tax. And then I looked at the 3 years prior to putting in the income tax. All right? And I looked at the major state metrics of those 11 states. So I took the year, now they all had different years they put it in. So I looked at 3 years prior to the introduction of the income tax, looked at the major state metrics, which are population. Now I did all of these, population as a share of the rest of the nation, the other 39 states, to get a correct metric there to compare. I looked at population, I looked at employment, I looked at labor force, I looked at migration, I looked at gross state product, which is probably the correct measure to use for any of these comparisons, and then I also looked at tax revenues. So I looked at the 3 years prior and all these major metrics. You follow me? Then they put in the income tax, and then I looked at the latest 3 years of all of these 11 states. So to get a 3-year average of those 11 states, you again follow me there? And I then looked at the same metrics. I looked at populations, the share of the rest of the nation. I looked at employment, labor force, gross state product, tax revenues, all of those things. Every single one of those 11 states, not one exception, in every single metric declined relative to the rest of the nation. Every single one, not one exception. All of those 11 states are in the very bottom of the performance levels of all the states in the U.S. You know, and some of those states really declined. I mean, Michigan, you know, it was Mitt Romney's dad who put in the income tax in Michigan, George Romney. He put it in. They put in a corporate tax in Detroit, 2% corporate tax. Michigan, when they put in the income tax, was 5.2% of the U.S. economy. Today, Michigan is a little under 2.7% of the U.S. economy. That is a catastrophic tailspin, classic demise of a state. In 1950, my mom and dad, you know, I was 10 years old at the time. My mom and dad used to, for vacation every now and then, we'd go on a train ride from Cleveland. I was born in Youngstown and raised in Cleveland. We'd go on a train ride to Detroit for our vacation. I mean, can you imagine that today? we go to Detroit. I mean, you know, Detroit was the Paris of North America. The train station was the Taj Mahal. Go back and look at the pictures of this place. It is absolutely incredible. In 1950, Detroit had a population of 1.85 million. Today, Detroit has a population under 600,000. I mean, that is a catastrophic decline. I mean, my home state of Ohio, I mean, it's just, again, the same thing that happened, just bam, it just collapsed right before your very eyes. The The one I want to go back to you on is New Jersey. Do all of you know New Jersey? I mean, just peripherally or in any way, shape, or form? I mean, New Jersey, as I said, in 1965, had neither an income tax nor a sales tax. It was the fastest growing state in the nation. It was the biggest in-migration. People from everywhere in the U.S. were migrating into New Jersey. All right? And it was, and it had a budget surplus. 9 years ago, when my student, a guy named John Corzine, was the governor of New Jersey, he's a student of mine at the University of Chicago. And in just full disclosure with you, C student. And after the revelations of MF Global, I'm not even sure you earned the C. To be honest, you probably cheated on that too. They had the highest property taxes, highest sales taxes, highest income taxes, and everyone in New Jersey was like rats leaving a sinking ship. They were leaving the slowest growing state in the nation, and they had a huge budget deficit. How did they do that? I mean, when you look at this stuff, it's just amazing what's going on in the political world. And these guys have I just was reading the New York Times this morning. The new governor of New Jersey, Murphy, is in there, wants to raise the millionaire's tax to 11% now. 11.5%. He wants to put on all. It's just, they don't learn, they don't look, they don't see, they have not a clue of this thing. I mean, in New Jersey, and if you look at it and you ask yourself the question, why would these people do this? I mean, pretend you're a fly on the wall in some legislature, some little place, I don't care which state it is that introduced the income tax, you're a fly on the wall and you're just looking at it. I mean, what would what would be the logic? Now, you know what people like, how I would talk. I mean, I'd say you don't want to raise taxes, you're going to provide disincentive, we've got a competitive thing among states, and if you raise your taxes, the businesses are going to leave, blah, 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 blah. But what would the people who want the income tax say? Well, what they'd say is pretty straightforward. Is, we need more revenue, we need it for schools, we need it for transportation, for police protection. Isn't that sort of the classic battle between the two? Well, there's data on this too. We have data going back more than 70 years on government spending by state, by cities, by counties, by local districts. We have just incredible amounts of data on this, and the full-time equivalent employees, their average pay, by day, by hour, by week, by month. I mean, these data are collected in incredible detail. So what I did was I looked at these states, these 11 states that had introduced the tax, and all of them hugely underperformed. And I went back and I said, what happened to the provision of public services? And we have it all there. About 50 to 55% of state spending or state employment is basically focused on education. K through 12, junior colleges, graduate schools, that's what the states do. And you find almost every state being in the 50 to 55% range there on all this. So what I did was I went to these 11 states and said, let's take a look and see what happened. I mean, it's as Larry Gatlin says, it ain't rocket surgery. Am I getting natural enough for you? It's just wonderful. He's one of my dear friends, and if your outflow exceeds your income, your upkeep will be your downfall. If that's not country talk, I don't know what the heck. It's just wonderful. But so I went back and I looked at all these data for education, and it's astounding. In those 11 states, I looked at the provision, and I'm just going to take you through the summary of it all. I mean, we have both input data, which are full-time equivalent employees, all right, and then we have output measurement data, because there are some groups like the Department of Education that looks at the NAEP scores, which are done by all states, done by the Department of Education. On 4th grade and 8th grade, they look at reading and math, and they do it about every 3rd to 5th year on all the states, so you get a good comparison. If you look at these 11 states, 8 of those states declined in the provision of public services to their state citizens. Declined. 3 of them did improve, and the ones that improved by a little bit. But of the 8 states that declined, 5 of them declined catastrophically. I mean, California has the highest paid teachers in the U.S., bar none. Very close. New Jersey's really in there, trying to get them. California, when I did the book, which was 5 years ago, was the third lowest test scores in the nation, only being beaten by Mississippi and New Mexico or Louisiana, depending on which year it was. I mean, highest paid, lowest performance levels there. I mean, you can look at all of this stuff. I mean, my home state of Tennessee, that I am now, we are the lowest tax state in the nation, bar none. We have no income tax, we have no unearned income tax, we have no death tax, we have probably the 8th lowest property taxes. Now, we do have a high franchise tax, that's true, but it's a little tiny base. It's wrong, but it's still a little base. We have our sales tax, which is our workload tax. But even there, we have a very high sales tax rate, but we're 12th highest. We're not the highest by any means. But that's our workload. That's where we get our revenues from the sales tax there. If you look at Tennessee by total tax burden, which is total tax revenues divided by gross state product, we are the total taxes, we're the lowest. If you exclude, as the tax foundation does, severance taxes, we're the 3rd lowest. Are you with me? We're the fastest growing state in the nation. Bingo. Not only are we the fastest growing state in the nation, shock, oh shock, I don't know how this happens, but we have the largest budget surplus of any state in the nation. How the hell does that happen? Low taxes, budget surplus, that's silly. Not only that, we have the highest credit rating in the nation, literally, the #1. Our pension funds in our state are fully funded. Depending on looking at Pew, we're the 5th highest funded state pensions. If you look at Mercatus, we're 3rd highest. If you look at Stanford, Hoover, we're #1 in the nation. We don't have the Rocky Mountains, we don't have the beaches of California, or we don't have any of this wonderful stuff of Florida and Key West and wherever it comes from. New York City, we just don't have that. We don't have the Great Lakes. But for some reason, people keep moving into Tennessee. We have this huge in-migration. And not only do they move into Tennessee, but they bring their money with them. In the last decade, our adjusted gross income for the state increased by 4.5% because of net in-migration of dollars, of income. I mean, it's incredible. If you look at our school performances and highways, we were in 1983 when Lamar Alexander became governor, we were the 37th best highway system in the nation. We're now 8th best. Not only that, but our schools, if you look at the ones I told you about, 4th and 8th grade, we have the single most, the largest improvement in education, 4th grade and 8th grade reading and math. In every single category in the nation, we're #1 in improvement. We've eliminated the gap between male and female, and we've reduced the gap between African American and non-African American by 50%. I mean, when you look at this stuff, the evidence is there. Without numbers, these guys are just spinning tails. What I want to do now is swing you over to the U.S., the macro economy here. If you look at the United States as of a year and 4 months ago, the day Donald Trump took office, there is one measure and only one measure. There is one measure and only one measure of economic performance, period, that's correct. The spin meisters will be out there spending employment in western Idaho or boxcar loadings in Oakland, California, or any of these number of things. There's one measure that's the correct measure, and that's gross domestic product. That is the sum total of all goods and services produced within the confines of the U.S. in a fixed period of time. There is no measure that trumps that measure. That is the only complete, comprehensive measure of the performance of an economy. Now you have to judge that you have to adjust that measure a little bit. For example, if gross domestic product goes up by 20% and prices go up by 20%, there's been no increase in real gross domestic product. You're just doubling the increase in the price of everything by 20%. So what you have to look at is you have to look at gross domestic product for a place, which means deflating at real gross domestic product, deflated for inflation. You with me in this? You follow me? That gives you a sense there of what's really going on in the economy. Now, whenever I travel, and I travel a heck of a lot abroad, the first thing I look at is I try to look at a comparison. Now, it's really hard to compare Luxembourg with the United States on gross domestic product. The U.S. always had more gross domestic product than Luxembourg, always. So what you really need to do is normalize the series or adjust the series for the size of the economy. Now, what I do is I look at real gross domestic product per adult. Now, the reason I use the per adult rather than per capita is I argue that 40-year-olds don't produce much output. Someone reminded me the other day that most adults don't either. But nonetheless, I stick with gross domestic product per adult. This gives you a really good way of cross-sectional comparing things. When I go to Kazakhstan or Ukraine or the Philippines or North Africa, which I just was there, the first thing I do is I look at real gross domestic product per adult, and you get a real good sense. You get your arm around the trunk of the tree about relative prosperity in the different places. You really do. So real gross domestic product is great for any type of cross-sectional comparisons of economies. Now, if you want to do a time series, intertemporal comparison, you got to do a little bit of another adjustment. You got to look at real gross domestic product per adult. But then you have to look at it detrended. How do I compare the United States in 1975 with the United States in 1996 or 2012? Well, you know there's sort of a progression of trend of growth and real output per adult over time. So what I do is I look at real gross domestic product per adult detrended. Now I start my measure in the United States with 1950. So I look at real gross domestic product per adult in 1950. I look at it in 2017, and I just take that trend and I detrend it to compare different periods. And if you look at it, you get a beautiful picture of the U.S. I mean, you get the U.S. coming out of World War II with an enormous expansion, and then you get Eisenhower being elected in 1952. The first thing the man did was veto Bob Taft's tax cuts, put in all sorts of regulations, he and Nixon, and they did a lousy job on the U.S. economy. The real gross domestic product per adult declined relative, detrended, declined. And then you got the election of 1960, which was between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon, as you may have read in the history books. Kennedy ran on a slogan of a return to normalcy. He ran on the slogan of cutting tax rates to get America going and growing again. He cut the highest marginal income tax rate from 91% to 70%, the lowest rate from 20 to 14%. He cut the corporate rate from 52 to 48%. He tried to cut it to 46%, but thank God Barry Goldwater stopped him from that irresponsible thing. He cut the highest rate from 91 to 70. Bob Dole voted against cutting the highest tax rate from 91 to 70. He said we couldn't afford the revenue losses. John F. Kennedy, not only did that, he put in the investment tax credit for U.S., increased the incentives to save, invest, increase productivity. Kennedy also had the Kennedy Brown tariff negotiation, where we cut taxes on traded products by 35%. Accelerated depreciation, he did that. I mean, it was just an amazing period. And if you look at Kennedy, okay, and by the way, he also was a very big hawk. He increased defense spending enormously. He cut taxes, increased defense spending enormously. Does it remind you of any other president? Well, just thought I'd mention that. He was Ronald Reagan all the way, only in a Democratic club. If you look at real gross domestic product per adult detrended, it goes right to the ceiling under Kennedy. And then we get a period there of the Four Stooges, which is, I call them Four Stooges, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, and Carter. The largest assemblage of bipartisan ignorance probably ever put in a country. If you look at that period where it was just, do any of you remember the wage and price? Do you remember Jerry Ford falling down the airplane steps? I don't, with inflation now, which is just a tax surcharge or Lyndon Johnson stuff, right? It's just crazy stuff. And you see the real gross domestic product per adult detrended, declining sharply, and then, and Jimmy Carter, the National Energy Plan, if you remember all that. But then, certainly, well, I'm just joking. 1980, the skies parted. The sun shone forth on the planet. The fields, they turned green. The animals, they multiplied, the trees blossomed and bore fruit, and the children danced in the streets. And Reagan was nominated and was elected. Oh, be still my heart. What we didn't do, let me take you, we dropped the highest rate from 70% to 28%. I won't go through all the Reagan stuff, but you saw that gross domestic product per adult trend, it just went under Reagan. Then we got George Herbert Walker Bush. It lulled down again. There he was. And then, of course, Bill Clinton came in. Now, Bill Clinton, I voted for Bill Clinton twice. I thought he was a great president. I thought he was a disgusting person. But I held my nose and I voted for him. I sure as heck did not let my daughter intern in that White House. But Clinton got rid of the retirement test and Social Security. All right, it used to be when you were age 65 to 72, every dollar you earned, you lost 50 cents in Social Security benefits. He got rid of that. He cut Social Security benefits by making them taxable. He did that. He put in the put in the capital gains tax cut, as you know, the biggest capital gain, exempted capital gains from owner-occupied homes from taxation, pretty amazing. Cut government spending as a share of GDP by 3.5 percentage points throughout his whole term, more than the next 4 best peacetime presidents combined. I can welfare reform, any of this stuff you want, and you had this huge surge. And then, 2000, you got W and Obama, and they are twins in my view. They're both really horrible. They were ones who believed that a poor person could spend himself into wealth, and Obama, and then also thought you could tax an economy into prosperity. And if you look at real gross domestic product per adult trend, it fell to the lowest point in the entire post-World War II period in 2016. All right, 2016 was the lowest. Boom. The U.S. was flat on its back, and literally the worst performance in 70 years, 65 years. This is the backdrop for what has happened in this coming administration. What you are seeing is a complete revolutionary shift in economic policies to a very pro-growth agenda. My best friend just was named chief economist for the president today. I don't know if any saw Larry Kudlow. To replace Gary Cohen, who I thought was also great as well.
Who did he call first?
I don't remember. Maybe Gary, you guess. But that's what happened. The president has been deregulating the economy. We have a tax bill, which I'm going to take you through a little bit. If you look at the corporate tax structure of the U.S. In 2017, if you look at it, our statutory corporate tax rate is 35%. All right, which it has been since 1992. George Herbert Walker Bush raised it from 34% to 35% in 1992. We cut it under Reagan from 46% to 34%, and then Bush raised it back up a little bit. But it's been at 35% since 1992. In the year 2000, we were the 7th highest statutory corporate tax rate in the OECD. In 2016, we were the highest statutory corporate tax rate of the OECD 34 countries. Every country in the OECD has reduced its corporate tax rate, statutory rate, with the exception of the US and Hungary. Hungary raised its corporate tax rate from 18% to 19%, and we've just been sitting, and we had the highest corporate tax rate in the OECD. We were the only country in the OECD to have a global tax. Let me tell you what that meant, and I'm sure you all know, but let me just bore you with it. American company and a German company in Ireland competing for business, wanting to do business in Ireland. Both of them make $100. Both companies have to pay the Irish government 12.5% tax for the Irish tax. For the German company, that's it. They have a territorial system. If you pay your local taxes, you don't owe any other taxes. For the U.S. company, the company was liable for an additional $22.50 to pay to the U.S. government, which puts the U.S. companies at an enormous disadvantage on this world competition. You follow me there? We cut, in this corporate tax, we cut the highest tax rate from 35% to 21%, which puts us a little bit above the mid-rank of the OECD today. But it's an enormous. It is the one tax that was desperately needed. What we also did was we also got rid of our global tax system. That's gone. We now have a territorial system just like the German company competing against the American company in Ireland. We have that. We put in 100% expensing of capital purchases for 5 years. That changes the internal rate of return on investments really dramatically. We not only did that, we cut the highest personal income tax rate from 39.6% to 37%. What you find in the literature is the two taxes that have the biggest slam to the economy and the biggest pump of adrenaline, the highest corporate tax rate and highest personal income tax rate are the two tax rates that really can rocket fuel the growth in an economy. We did that. We put in a pass-through tax. All right, we cut the personal income tax from 39.6 to 37, but we had a pass-through tax for pass-through corporations, LLCs, Subchapter S, these types of corporations, partnerships. This pass-through had a 20% deduction for revenues. So in fact, we lowered the pass-through tax rate from 39.6 to 28.6. I mean, that's what happened in this tax bill. There are a bunch of other things. One I loved, we got rid of the mandate on Obamacare. Can you imagine being required to pay a tax if you don't buy the government plan? I mean, where does that come from? You've got to be in some gulag to think about a plan. We got rid of that thing. It is an amazing thing that's happened. I want to take you through this because this, to me, is the single most important piece of legislation we've had in generations, probably since Reagan, since the '86 Tax Act. My guess is that with this tax bill, you're going to see a huge surge in output, employment, and production because of this tax rate reduction. Just to give you a flavor, having worked with the real president, by the way, you all know who I mean by Ronnie, working with him. But we had our tax bill in 1981. We phased in the tax cut, which was about the dumbest thing you could do. If you know they're going to cut tax rates next year, what do you do this year? You defer all the income you can until next year at the lower tax rate. So we created the 81-82 recession depression because we phased in the tax. But on January 1st, 1983, our tax cut took full effect. Guess with me, just guess with me, what the real growth of the U.S. economy was. From January 1st, 1983 to June 30th, 1984. What is that? That's 18 months? Is that right? Is that 6 quarters? Is that a year and a half period? What was the real growth in the U.S. economy?
7.5.
Anyone else? 12%.
Wow.
From January 1st, 83 to June 30th, 1980. Now that's over a year and a half. That was at an 8% annual compound rate. Those are Chinese growth rates, please. If you look at the growth rates under Kennedy's go-go 60s, where I took you through the tax rate, Kennedy throughout the period, including the rest of the Johnson, the Johnson fill-out period for his, grew at over 5% per annum. I mean, Reagan from January 1st, 83 to the end of his term, 88, grew at over 5% per annum compound growth rates. You don't hear these stories. You're talking about the new normal by Larry Summers and others of those guys. The new normal is 1.9% nonsense. I mean, the growth rates are amazing. Stock market growth. From August of 1982 to the end of Clinton, which was, let's say, August of 2000, this U.S. stock market, I'm going to just use the Dow or the S&P, anyone you want to name. What happened in the stock market? On August 14th, the Dow hit 777 as its low. By the time Clinton period ended there, just before the Y2K thing, okay, the market was up in nominal terms 13.5-fold. Fold. You think we have a bull market today? Try 13.5-fold increase. If you take out inflation, the stock market in real terms went up 7.5 times in that 750% increase over that period of time. I mean, it is just amazing when you look at the potential. You talk about budgets. These economists come in through and try to, the CBO and the Joint Committee on Taxes have all of my C students working for them. And they just don't get business. Let me try on this. What the CBO does is they look at what's going to be the growth. Okay, here's what the budget tax cuts are. Here you've got corporate taxes at 440 billion, all right? We're gonna cut the rate from 35 to 21, which is, I don't know what, a 30%, 35% cut in the tax rate. So that's 180 billion revenue loss, static revenue loss, you follow me there? And then over 10 years, it's gonna be 1.8 trillion, but with economic growth, it's gonna be 2.5 trillion. And that's gonna be the static revenue loss. And then they think there's gonna be some growth in there besides that. And then if you look at the personal income tax rates as well, you get 3 trillion. Then they say there's gonna be some growth and we're gonna be more jobs, more employment, and these people are gonna pay taxes, and you deduct that off. And we get 1.5 trillion net loss in corporate and total taxes during that 10-year period. 1.5 trillion loss. You with me? You hear this played out nonstop. If that's acres and acres of soap suds and horse manure. I try to argue that, let's imagine we had no growth whatsoever. And we cut the corporate tax rate from 35 to 21. Bang. Do you really think we'd have 3 trillion in losses in revenues? Now let's imagine you're a business person. I know all of you are academics, so if you look at just personal behavior responses, if I cut the rate from 35% to 21%, today GE and Exxon both pride themselves on paying no corporate taxes. They hire lawyers and accountants and deferred income specialists, favor grabbers, loopholes, lobbyists, all of that, to get all of these tax write-offs that they can, so that they pay no taxes whatsoever. At 35% tax rate, you're willing to spend $34.90 on the margin to save $100 in taxable income, aren't you? At 21% tax rate, you're only willing to spend $20.90. With the incentives being there, there's going to be a lot less tax sheltering as a response. Having nothing to do with economic growth, there's going to be a lot less. The economic literature finds that tax sheltering alone, the reduction in tax sheltering alone, will be more than enough to offset the tax losses. Believe me when I tell you. Believe me. If you look at the statutory corporate tax rate, it's 35% today. It was 35%, excuse me. It was 35%. And yet, the effective tax rate in the United States is 13%. Now, what does that mean? You hit the highest marginal corporate tax rate at $75,000 a year income. Every person who pays the corporate tax pays it at the 35% rate, period. There's not a, what the 13% means is they have sheltered so much of their income that over 2/3 of taxable income is sheltered. So therefore, they only pay tax on 1/3 of the income that they should at the 35% rate. It's not that anyone's paying the 13% rate. They're not. They're all paying 35% or zero. But they're spending a lot of money to get the sheltering there. If you reduce that tax rate, believe me, people are going to shelter a heck of a lot less. And you're going to find a lot more income reported than the shelter. You follow me that? Not only that, corporate tax reform, the corporate tax structure, business tax structure. There are all sorts of business types of organization forms for tax purposes and other purposes. As I mentioned, there are S corps, there are C corps, there are partnerships, there are LLCs, there are mutual savings banks, there are banking systems, there are insurance companies. If you were Warren Buffett, insurance companies, the biggest tax dodge that ever lived on planet Earth. There are hundreds of these organizational forms. What you find happening is when you cut the corporate tax rate, people choose different forms. Now, before the '86 Tax Act, what happened is C corps were declining dramatically as a share of total corporations. When we cut the rate from 46% to 34%, C corps popped right back up again. You're going to find an offset there on the choice of business forms, independent of economic growth. Tax evasion. Tax evasion is far more attractive at 35% than it is at 21%. It is way more attractive. The IRS estimates that 15 to 20% of all taxes owed are never collected. All right, that's the amount of tax, and it's almost all in the corporate form. James Perturba does all of this. If you drop that rate from 35 to 21%, corporate tax evasion is much less attractive. They'll be much less, and they'll actually pay their taxes. By the way, with less people evading taxes and the same amount of money on enforcement, The few people left ought to be awfully scared, so they'll also pay their way. That also will more than offset the tax. You follow me in this? Not only that, but corporations located in Ireland. You know, just because the corporate tax rate in Ireland is a lot less than it is in the US. The inversions, which have hit huge amounts in 2016 and 17, all of a sudden will stop. Those companies won't move to Ireland, they'll move back to the US. If they move back to the US, they'll pay corporate taxes in the US instead of Ireland or other countries. All of that was, some of the ones that used to be there, moved there 10 years ago, will come back as well. You already see a lot of it coming back. With Google and Microsoft and some of these others are bringing their monies back as well. Amazon, you've seen those numbers coming through. All of that will increase tax revenues with a tax rate reduction that has nothing to do with economic growth. And the one I want to just stress, I mean, two of them, I guess, corporate taxes are only 12.5% of all federal taxes. So every dollar of corporate tax, every dollar of corporate tax collected, there are 7 other dollars collected. Believe me, when you cut the corporate tax rate, if there's any economic growth, you're going to spur income taxes, sales taxes, property taxes, you're going to increase capital gains taxes, you're going to increase excise taxes, tariffs, I mean, all these other taxes are going to rise as a consequence of that as well. You follow me on where I'm going? And lastly, state and local taxes are about 70% of federal taxes. If a company comes back, it's got a lot of land in some state, some county, some city, somewhere. Those taxes will rise. Let me just give you the number here. When Reagan, if Obama's growth from the NBER trough in 2009 had been the same as Reagan's economic growth from the NBER trough in 1983, had been the same following that, state and local tax revenues would have been $781 billion larger in 2016 for that 1 year alone. That swamps the $180 billion loss you're talking about, possibly from the whole tax and static. Do you follow me? Let me just tell you that you're going to get, I believe, one of the biggest booms. It's going to reverse the policies. Not only that, I think you're going to see the equity markets coming back to where they recognize the full value of this thing. I think we are beginning a new period in U.S. history where U.S. real GDP growth per adult D-trend is going to be on a very sharp rise, as it was under Kennedy, as it was under Reagan, as it was under Clinton. I think you're going to see that rise at similar periods there. I think that growth could be far exceed what the administration is saying at 3%. I think that the estimates of revenue losses are silly.